There are 2 pages a man once let me copy out of a courthouse basement in the mountains of western North Carolina, and I have kept them together ever since, because apart they don't mean much, and together they will keep you up at night. The first is a page out of a trade store fur ledger from the spring of 1883. It is, by every account I have ever been able to find, the best single season anybody ever turned in at that store. Mink and otter and red fox, marten, a whole wall of prime beaver, all of it brought down in one winter by one party of trappers. The storekeeper had to start a fresh page for them. You can still read where his pencil pressed hard, totting up money that no trapping outfit in that country had any business seeing. The second page is a county record from the 12 months that came after, and it is a list of deaths, and it is the same men. Every trapper whose name runs big in that fur ledger is on the death list inside of a year. Every single one. And not a one of them died the way a mountain man dies, in a rock slide, or under a tree, or of the fever. Every one of them was found out in the open, in the snow, or along a trace, or at the edge of his own dooryard. No mark on him, no sign he ever struggled, just laid down easy and quiet in the cold, the way you would find a rabbit gone still in a snare, on a line you forgot to check. I want to tell you how a record season and a death list come to be the same list of men. This one came to me the way the truest ones do. Slow, from an old man who outlived everybody who could have called him a liar. So before I go on, do me one small thing. Wherever you are tonight, whatever town, whatever country, however late it has gotten where you're sitting, leave a light burning in one other room of the house. Not for you. Just leave it. And tell me down in the comments where you're listening from, because on a story like this one, it helps to know the fire's got a crowd around it. It begins with a place the local people will still tell you not to trap. They call it Hardwood Hollow. A deep cove back in the Black Mountains, all big old hardwood timber, oak and poplar and chestnut. The kind of bottom that ought to be trapped out and shot out and gone, the way every good cove in those mountains was by the 1880s. Except Hardwood Hollow never was. The old trappers stepped around it. And here is the thing that made it a story, instead of just a superstition. It wasn't poor. That cove was the richest ground any of them had ever seen. The sign was thick year after year. Mink stacked along every branch, fox crossing every ridge, beaver in ponds that should have been trapped flat 2 generations back. A man could stand at the mouth of Hardwood Hollow in the dead of winter and see more fur in an hour than he'd see all season anywhere else in the range. And every old trapper worth the name walked on past it. Because there was a rule about Hardwood Hollow. Nobody had written it down. It went hand to hand, mouth to ear, the way the real rules in that country always did. The ones that keep men alive where there's no law closer than 3 days' walk. You could work that cove, the rule said, once. One winter in your life, if you needed it bad. But you worked it a particular way, and you took it a particular amount, and you left when you were told to leave. And there was a reason for every part of it, and the reason was that Hardwood Hollow was already somebody's line. We'll get into whose and what that means here directly. The man at the center of this is named Vance Trantham, and I'll be fair to him, because the old man who told me this was fair to him, even after everything. Vance was not a bad man to start. He was a trapper. A good one, hard and tireless, with a wife and a house full of young ones down on a creek that didn't grow much but rock. And he had just come through 3 lean winters in a row. You have to understand what that meant up there. Fur was the cash. Fur was the doctor, and the seed corn, and the shoes. 3 bad seasons running, and a man with a family is not poor, he is scared, and a scared man with mouths to feed will talk himself past a great many warnings. So when Vance Trantham started asking around, quiet, that fall of 1882, about whether the sign was still thick up in Hardwood Hollow, the older heads knew exactly what he was working up the nerve to do. Most of them just shook their heads and changed the subject. They'd seen it before. Every generation or so, some man got hungry enough or proud enough to go work that cove. And most of those men, if they did it right, came out the once and never went near it again, and never would say why. But one old trapper didn't just shake his head. He came down off his own ridge and sat with Vance on Vance's porch a long evening, and he told him the whole of the rule, every part of it, plain. That old man's name was Absalom Sturgill. He was past 70 that winter, and he had trapped Hardwood Hollow himself one season 50 years before, as a young man, and walked out poor and grateful, and never gone back. Absalom is the reason we know any of this. He is the one man in this story who lived, and the thing he could never forgive himself for, the thing he carried to the end of a very long life, was not anything he did up in that cove. It was that he was the one who told Vance Trantham how to get in. That's where I'll leave the first part, with an old man on a porch, doing a kindness, telling a hungry younger man the rules of a place, and not yet knowing that the younger man had already decided to keep only the parts he liked. So pour yourself something warm and trim the lamp low. And if you're ever shown a rich and easy place that everybody older than you steps around, ask yourself why they leave all that money lying there. Then leave it lying too. So let me give you the rule, the way Absalom Sturgill gave it to Vance Trantham on that porch, because the whole of this story is just what happens when a man keeps the easy parts of a rule and throws away the hard ones. The first thing Absalom told him was the thing that took the longest for Vance to swallow. Hardwood Hollow, the old man said, is not empty ground that happens to be full of game. It is a worked line. Somebody traps that cove. Somebody has trapped it longer than there has been a courthouse to hold a fur ledger, longer than there's been a settlement down on the river, longer than anybody can rightly say. The game is thick in there for the same reason. Game is thick on any well-kept line. It is tended. It is taken careful and never taken out. And the man, or the thing, whose line it is, does not mind another trapper working through it for a season. The mountains were big, and the fur was deep, and there was enough. But you work it the way you would work through another man's territory, if you had any raising at all. You ask, in your way. You take a guest's share, and no more, and you leave. Then he gave Vance the particulars, and there were only 4, and I want you to count them with me, because Vance broke every one. 1. You take only what your own sets earn, in fair sets, set by your own hand. The fur your traps catch is yours. That is the guest's share, and it is a generous one in that cove. 2. The first catch of your season, and the last catch of your season, you do not keep. You hang them back on the line, whole and unskinned, as the dew. Absalom called it leaving the woods its wages. You came in poor, and you take a fortune out of another man's ground, and you pay for it with the first thing you catch and the last. That is the rent. 3. And this was the one Absalom leaned on hardest. You will find catches in that cove that are not in your sets. You will come up your line of a morning, and there will be fur waiting for you, in a deadfall you never built, in a snare you never tied, hung on a limb where you set nothing at all. Prime fur, easy. easy fur. More of it as the winter goes on, and finer. You do not touch it. It is not yours. It is the other trapper's catch, left on the other trapper's line, and the moment you take a single pelt out of a set you did not make, you have stopped being a guest working through and started being a thief working a man's line behind his back. And that man is more patient than you can imagine, and he is always, always checking his line. And 4. You leave Hardwood Hollow before the deep thaw. When the ice goes off the still water and the ground softens, your season is over. Whatever's left hanging. You take your fair catch and your traps, and you walk out, and you do not look back up the cove. Stay past the thaw, the old man said, and you are no longer passing through. You have moved in, and there is only room on that line for the one who was there first. That was the whole of it. Take only your own. Leave the first and the last. Never touch a set you didn't make. Leave before the thaw. 4 things. Absalom said them twice, slow, and then he sat there in the dark and waited to see if the younger man had heard him. And here's the part I keep turning over. Vance Trantham did hear him. He wasn't a fool. He nodded in all the right places. He even thanked the old man and meant it. But somewhere under the nodding, a man who had buried 2 children in 3 lean years was already doing arithmetic. Because Absalom had just told him there was free fur up there. Fur he wouldn't even have to set for. Fur just hanging on the line of a morning, finer than anything his own traps would take, and getting finer all winter. And the only thing standing between Vance Trantham and the richest haul of his life was a rule an old man swore by and couldn't explain past you do not, because that is how it has always been. I have thought about you sitting there, hearing me lay this out, and I'd guess a good many of you already know exactly what Vance is going to do. And you want to reach back across 140 years and shake him. Hold on to that feeling, because I want to ask you something, the way I'd ask it if you were here by the fire with me. Have you ever been told not to do a thing and given no reason for it that satisfied you, only the weight of somebody older being afraid? And did some stubborn part of you decide that no reason meant no reason, that the fear was just old people being old? That feeling, that exact one, is the most dangerous thing a person owns. It has walked more men into the dark than greed ever did. Greed gets you to the edge. But it's that little voice saying, they never could tell me why, that takes you over it. Now, whose line is it? Absalom would never say, not flat out, and I've come to think he didn't rightly know, the way none of them knew. The way you can know a thing is true your whole life, and never once have looked it in the face. But he told Vance the little that gets passed down, and I'll pass it to you. Long before the settlement, before the fur companies, before any of the names we have for that country, somebody trapped those mountains. And of all the coves and all the lines that one ran, this one cove he kept. Tended it, fed it, let it grow rich the way you'd keep one field rich and lying fallow. And he never left it. The settlement came and went. Its business down on the river, and the seasons turned, and the fur trade rose and fell, and up in Hardwood Hollow, the line stayed kept, and the catches stayed thick, and the one whose line it was kept right on checking it, patient as snowfall. He did not begrudge a hungry man a season's passing through, but he counted what was his, and what was taken from his sets he took back. That is what Vance Trantham walked up into Hardwood Hollow that winter to share a season with. 4 men behind him, a string of traps, and a head full of arithmetic that had already crossed out the 3rd rule. The youngest of those four was a boy of 19 named Riley Buchanan, on his first real season, who thought Vance Trantham hung the moon. Keep that boy in your mind. We'll need him. They went up into Hardwood Hollow in the first hard week of December, the five of them, and built a line camp back in the timber, a lean cabin and a fire, and a long string of sets running up both sides of the cove. And for the first stretch, Vance kept the rule. I think he meant to. I think a man can mean to, right up until the moment he doesn't. The fair sets, the ones they built with their own hands, caught the way Absalom had promised. Caught better than any of them had ever seen. The first morning they ran the line, they came back to camp with more prime fur than Vance's whole creek would turn in a normal month. And Riley Buchanan, the boy, was lit up like Christmas. And even the older hands were quiet, the way men go quiet when a thing is going almost too well. And Vance, to his credit, did the hard part first. The very first catch of the season, a big dark mink. He carried up the cove and hung it back on the line, whole, unskinned, the way the old man said. The wood's its wages. The men watched him do it and didn't say anything, and they kept the rule because he kept it, and the fur kept coming. It was about the second week that the other catches started. Riley found the first one, came up his stretch of the line of a gray morning, and there, hanging from a poplar limb, where not one of them had said a thing, was a marten. A fine one, prime, already gone, still and cold, just hanging there by nothing, waiting to be taken. The boy stood and looked at it a long while, because he remembered the rule they all did. Vance had drilled it into them on the walk up. You don't touch a set you didn't make. So Riley left it and came back to camp and told it like a ghost story, the marten hanging from nothing on a limb. And Vance Trantham went up and looked at it himself. He didn't take it. Not that day. But the old man who told me this said you could date everything that came after. To the morning Vance Trantham stood under that poplar and looked up at a prime marten worth more than a day's hard trapping, hanging there free for the reaching, and did the arithmetic one more time, and felt the old rule start to come loose in his hands, because there was more of it the next day, and the day after. Snares they never tied with fox in them. Deadfalls they never built, sprung and holding, and it was always finer than what their own sets took, as if the line itself were sweetening the offer, raising the bid a little richer every morning. Other trappers catch, hanging on the other trapper's line, exactly as Absalom had warned. And every morning, Vance walked past it, getting a little slower. And one cold morning, near the end of the third week, he reached up and took down a black fox, worth more than his wagon. And he did not look at the other men when he did it, and nobody said a word. After that, it came apart fast, the way these things do once the first stone's pulled. Once Vance took one, he had to take them all, because to leave the rest was to admit the first was a theft. So they stripped the strange sets every morning right along with their own, and the camp filled up with fur, racks and racks of it, the finest any of them had ever handled. And the men stopped talking about the rule like it was real and started talking about it like it was a story old Absalom told to keep competitors out of a good cove. Greed does that. It doesn't just make you take. It goes back and rewrites the warning into a trick, so you can feel clever instead of afraid. And the strange sets kept sweetening, the way they had from the start, except now there was not a morning without them. They came up the line, and the easy catches were laid out, waiting like a table set for company. Marten and mink and the black fox, yes, but stranger coin too as the winter wore on. A fisher, which is a fortune all by itself, and rare as honesty in that country. Then an otter, hung dripping from a limb, miles up the cove, from any water an otter had business in, as though the cold itself couldn't quite finish taking it. And then, a gray morning, near the turn of the year, a wolf. A timber wolf, prime and huge, of a kind that had been shot and poisoned and trapped out of those mountains before Vance Trantham was ever born. Not one man in that party had seen a living wolf in his whole life, and here was one hanging fresh in a snare none of them tied, in a country that had no wolves left to catch. Doc Yelton, one of the older hands, stood under it a long while, and then said, low, to nobody in particular, that they were being paid in coin that hadn't been minted in 50 years. Nobody answered him. They took the wolf down with the rest of it. It was worth too much to leave. And by then, leaving anything at all was the one thing none of them could do, because to leave it was to say out loud that they'd been thieving all along. Riley Buchanan stopped sleeping right around then. The old man told me that part quiet, like it still cost him to say. The boy would lie awake in the lean cabin and listen, because if somebody was building those sets in the dark, then somebody was out there in the cold every single night, close, and maybe a body could hear him work, if a body stayed still enough. Riley never heard one thing. That was what frightened him. Not a footstep, not a branch breaking, not the small click of a trigger being set on a line that grew a dozen fresh catches, a night not 30 feet from where 5 men slept. Whatever tended that line, tended it in a silence that was not natural, and the boy lay awake inside that silence and did the sum nobody else would do out loud. 5 of them in the cabin, and one more every night just past the edge of the firelight, working. Let me step out from the fire for just a second, because we're coming to the part of this that turns, and I want you with me when it does. If this is the kind of story you'll carry out of the woods with you tonight, take a half a second and subscribe before we go on. It's free. It's how the people who decide these things know to let me keep telling them, and it means the next fire I light, you'll be sitting at it. That's the whole of the ask. A bigger crowd, a brighter fire. Now come back up the cove with me, because Vance Trantham has just gotten greedy enough to break the 3rd rule clean through, and the line has noticed, and the line is patient. Here's the thing nobody in that camp let themselves say out loud, though the old man swore Riley said it to him once, low, by the fire, near the end. The catches in the sets they never made. Somebody was making those sets. Every night, while 5 men slept in a lean cabin with the fire banked, somebody was walking that line in the dark and the cold and the deep snow, building deadfalls and tying snares and hanging fur for them to find. Working the line, tending it, the way the owner of a line does. They were not stealing from an empty woods. They were taking, night after night, the catch of a trapper who was right there with them, in that cove, the whole winter long, close enough every single night to set a snare an arm's length off their own, and not one of them had ever seen him. Not once. That is not a man who hasn't noticed you on his line. That is a man who is deciding, slow, what you are worth. And all the while, the snow got deeper, and the still water held its ice, and the days started, just barely, to stretch. And Vance Trantham, with a camp full of the finest fur in the history of that country, and the bit fully in his teeth, looked at the strange sets, coming up richer every morning, and made the worst decision of his life, the one that turned a rich season into a death list. He decided they weren't leaving at the thaw. Why would they? He said. The fur was only getting better. Another 3 weeks, a month, and they'd carry out a haul that would set every one of them up for life. The lean years gone for good. Old Absalom and his thaw, and his wages and his line. That was an old man's fear, and fear didn't feed children. They'd stay till the cove was wrung dry and walk out kings. Riley Buchanan, 19 years old, was the only one who said maybe they ought to go when the old man said go. And Vance Trantham laughed at him, kind enough, the way you laugh at a boy, and told him there was nothing up in that hollow but money and weather. He was wrong about that. And the line was about to show them exactly how wrong, in a set none of them had built, sprung on something that no trapper, in any cove, in any winter, was ever meant to catch. It was Riley who found that one too. The boy always was first up the line. Near the head of the cove, in a stand of big timber, where the snow lay deep and blue in the early light, there was a deadfall none of them had built. A big one. A heavy log set on a figure-4 trigger, the kind of fall you'd lay for a bear, far bigger than anything you'd need for the fur they'd been taking. And it had been sprung. And there was something under it. The old man would never tell me plainly what Riley saw under that log, and I have come to believe Riley never told him plainly either, that some things a 19-year-old boy sees in a blue dawn in a cove that belongs to something else, he just packs down small and carries and doesn't take back out and look at. What Absalom would say was this: it was not an animal. It was the size of a man, or near it, and it was caught the way they'd been catching everything all winter, clean and quiet, and held. And it had been under that fall, long enough to go still and cold, and it was the first thing that whole winter that the trapper of Hardwood Hollow had let them find of himself. Not fur on a limb, not an easy catch sweetening the bid, a thing in a trap that should never be in a trap, left square in their path at the head of the cove where they could not miss it. It was a message, is what it was, and the message was, you have taken from every set on my line all winter. Here is one more set, and here is what I catch, and now you know we are the same, you and I, working the same ground. So, what do you mean to do? That night was the worst of the whole winter in that cabin, and the most honest. Nobody mentioned the fur. 5 grown men sat around a fire they kept built up too high and listened to the cove, and the cove gave them back nothing at all, which was worse than any sound it could have made. Riley Buchanan said it plain, the only one of them who would. He said they ought to leave the whole take and go down the mountain at first light with empty hands, the way the old man told them, and beg pardon the whole way down. And for 1 minute, Absalom thought, for just 1 minute, Vance Trantham nearly listened, because even Vance had finally felt the floor drop out from under his arithmetic. You could take fur off an empty woods and call it luck. You could not stand over what was under that deadfall and call it anything but what it was. But a year of want was behind Vance Trantham, and a fortune was stacked on his sleds, and morning came up gray and ordinary, the way mornings do. Ordinary daylight is the great thief of good sense. By the time the sun was full up, Vance had talked himself back into being a man who'd merely had a bad scare in the dark, and a man who's only been scared wants one thing, which is to get his goods to safety, fast. A wiser man, a man who'd kept the fear, would have dropped his fur where he stood and walked out of that cove, and never slept easy again, but slept. Vance Trantham looked at the thing under the deadfall, and what he felt, God help him, was caught. Found out. Like a man whose theft has been seen. And a certain kind of man, when he's caught, doesn't give the goods back. He grabs everything he can carry, and he runs. And the thaw was coming on. The ice was going soft on the still water. Their season, by every part of the rule, was over, was passed over. So Vance Trantham did the thing that turned all of it. He didn't leave the take. He loaded it. Every pelt in that camp, the fair catch and the stolen catch, all jumbled together onto the spring sleds. And he drove his men down out of Hardwood Hollow in a hard run, past the thaw, hauling the richest haul anybody ever took from those mountains. And, riding down invisible on top of it, a debt to the one whose line they'd robbed. There was one man who didn't run with them, because old Absalom Sturgill had come up the cove. He'd not been able to sleep, he told me, the whole back half of that winter. Lying in his own cabin miles off, an old man, knowing what he'd set in motion by talking on that porch. So when the thaw came on, he walked up into Hardwood Hollow himself, one last time, to try to talk Vance down. And he got there just in time to watch them load the sleds. He stood in the snow, and he begged Vance to leave the take. "Leave it all," he said. "Hang it back on the line, every pelt, the fare with the stolen. Leave the wages and the rest besides, and walk out with empty hands and your life. It's not too late if your hands are empty." Vance Trantham looked at an old poor man, telling him to throw away a fortune, and he saw exactly what he'd decided to see all winter, which was fear dressed up as wisdom, and he drove his loaded sleds on down the mountain. And Absalom Sturgill, 70 years old, standing in that emptying cove with the thaw coming on, did the only thing left that he knew how to do. He kept the rule. He'd run a few fair sets of his own up the side of the cove that winter. Quiet, not greedy, a guest's handful. He went and pulled them. He took his own small fair catch, a poor man's season, and the first pelt of it, and the last, he carried up and hung back on the line, whole, the wages, the way he'd done it 50 years before as a young man. And then he picked up his traps, and he turned his back on a cove full of the finest fur in the world, and he walked out of Hardwood Hollow with empty pockets and a clean account before the ice was fully off the water. That is why he lived. Not luck, the rule. He came in a guest, and he left a guest, and he paid what a guest pays, and the line had nothing of his to take back. Vance's party turned in their haul at the trade store down on the river that spring, and the storekeeper started a fresh page, and word ran up and down every creek in the country about the Trantham outfit and the season they'd had in some cove they wouldn't name. For a few weeks, they were the richest, luckiest trappers in the mountains. The first one died before the dogwoods bloomed. It was one of the older hands, the quietest of them. They found him sitting against a fence rail at the edge of his own pasture, in a little unseasonable skift of late snow, his hat still on, his pipe still in his hand. No mark on him, not fallen, not struggling, just sitting easy, gone cold, the way you'd find something that had stepped into a snare and simply, quietly, stopped. The kind of death a trapper gives. Patient, tidy, checked off the line. And up in Hardwood Hollow, the old man knew, though he was miles away and told no one yet. The one whose line it was had started, slow and sure, and in no hurry at all, to collect what Vance Trantham had carried down the mountain and out into the world, on top of all that beautiful fur. They went one at a time all that year, and they went quiet. That was the thing that finally broke the men who were left, the old man said. Not that their partners were dying. Men died in those mountains. It was the way of it. Always the same. Always alone. Always out in the open. Always in a little patch of cold even when the season had no business being cold. Always found sitting or lying easy. No wound, no fear in the face, nothing knocked over, nothing fought. A man would just not come in to supper, and they'd go looking, and they'd find him out along a trace, or at the spring, or in the lower field, gone still and cold as a catch on a line nobody got back to in time. The quietest of the older hands went first, in the spring, against his own fence rail, the one I already told you about. Then it took Doc Yelton, who'd named the coin that hadn't been minted in 50 years, and who of all of them tried the hardest to think his way clear. Doc did the sensible modern thing. He left, sold what he could, and moved his whole family clean out of the mountains, down to a mill town in the flat country, where there wasn't a trap line within 100 miles, and a man was just one more face in a crowd of faces. He lasted into high summer. They found him on a Sunday at the edge of the mill pond, his shoes off and his feet in the water, and all around him in the middle of July, in the low, hot country, the grass stood white, with frost in a ring you could have stepped across. No mark on him, hat still on, gone cold in the heat of the year. You cannot move off a line. That is the thing Doc Yelton taught the last men left alive. Distance is nothing to a thing that patient. It does not have to chase you anywhere. It only has to wait and check the line and come when it is good and ready. And a mill pond in July is no farther from that cove than the cove is from itself, if your name is on it. The trade store fortune did none of them a bit of good, because you cannot spend your way off another man's line, and one by one the Trantham outfit was being taken back up it. Riley Buchanan was the one the old man could never tell without stopping, because the boy figured it out. Of all of them, the youngest, the one who'd wanted to leave at the thaw. After the second man died, Riley came down off his creek and found old Absalom and sat with him a whole night, white-faced, and Absalom told him the truth, all of it, the line and the wages and the rule, and what it meant that they'd hauled the takedown past the thaw. And Riley said, "Then I'll give it back. I'll carry my share back up and hang it on the line. All of it. Every pelt I can still lay hands on, and I'll leave the wages, and I'll make it right." And Absalom, who loved that boy a little by then, had to tell him the hardest thing he knew, that he could try, that it was the only thing worth trying, but that the rule about giving back was the one rule he'd never been taught, because in 50 years he had never once heard of a man who took from those sets and lived to need it. Give back the fur, Absalom told him. Leave the wages. Beg its pardon on its own line. Maybe a thing that patient can take payment late, but go with empty hands and an honest heart and ask, "Boy, don't go to take one more thing. Go only to give." Riley Buchanan carried his whole season's fur back up into Hardwood Hollow that autumn, alone, to hang it on a line he didn't own and ask the pardon of something he'd never seen. They found him a week later, up at the head of the cove, sitting against the base of a big poplar with his empty fur sack folded neat in his lap. He'd hung every pelt. The old man went up himself after, and saw it, the boy's whole fortune, hung careful back along the line. The wages left, everything given. Riley had done it exactly right, and it had not been enough, because he had stayed past the thaw once, months before, on Vance Trantham's say-so. And on that line, a debt is a debt, and the young are the easiest taken. He looked, Absalom said, like he'd sat down to rest a minute in the cold, and just decided not to get up. No fear in him at all. I have held on to that part, for whatever it's worth. Whatever came up that cove to collect Riley Buchanan, the boy met it with his hands empty, and his account as square as he could make it, and it did not frighten him at the end. Vance Trantham was the last. He held out longest, and he held out hardest, because by then he knew, and a man who knows will fight. He'd spent the fortune trying, doctors and preachers and a man down in the low country who claimed to know charms, and none of it was any more use than the money. He took to sleeping with lamps in every room and a loaded gun across his knees, which tells you he'd finally understood, too late, that there was something to be afraid of. It found him the next winter, a year almost to the day from the season in the cove. In his own dooryard, in the snow, the lamps all burning yellow in the windows behind him, and the gun still in his hands and never fired. Sitting down easy in the cold, caught. The richest trapper those mountains ever made, taken off the line last, the way you'd save the biggest pelt for the end, and that, the old man said, was the whole of the Trantham outfit. 5 men up, 1 season, the best fur ever seen. 5 men down across the year that followed, every one of them given back to the cove that owned them. So let me close out the things I can close, because you came up this whole cove with me, and you've earned the answers. Why was the game so thick in Hardwood Hollow? Because it was a kept line, tended longer than the settlement had a name, and a kept line is rich. Why the rule? All 4 parts of it. Because every part was a way of staying a guest instead of becoming a thief, and a guest is let pass, and a thief is collected. What did they bring back from the winter hunt? Not the fur. The fur was just fur. They brought back the claim of the one whose sets they'd robbed, carried down the mountain on top of the pelts and out into the settled world where it had never been. And it spent a year, patient as snow, taking back exactly what was owed. Why did it take them the way it did? Quiet and tidy, and out in the cold. Because that is how that one takes everything. It is a trapper. It does not chase and it does not rage. It sets, and it waits, and it checks the line, and what it has marked, it collects. And why did old Absalom Sturgill live when he'd been up that same cove, when he was the one who opened the door? Because he kept the rule, every part of it, twice over, 50 years apart. He came a guest, and he left a guest, and he paid what a guest pays, and the line never had one thing of his to take back. He outlived all of them by 30 years and died in his own bed, which is the only happy ending this story has, and he never once felt he deserved it. Hardwood Hollow is still up there. I'll tell you that, and then I'll let you go. The cove is still thick. The old people in that country will still tell you, if you ask the right one the right way, that the game up there is something to see and that you'd best go see it somewhere else. The line is still kept. The one whose it is still checks it. And every generation or so, the story goes, some man gets lean enough or proud enough to forget why everybody older steps around all that easy money and walks up into Hardwood Hollow to take a season. Some of them, the ones who keep the old rule, walk out poor and whole and never say why. So here is the only thing I'd have you carry out of these woods. And it's the same thing Absalom Sturgill spent 30 years wishing one hungry man had heard. If you are ever shown a place that is rich and easy and standing wide open, and everyone older than you steps wide around it and cannot quite tell you why, do not mistake their silence for foolishness. Somebody already works that ground. Take only what's fairly yours, if you take anything at all. Leave the first and the last. Never help yourself to a catch you didn't earn. And when it's time to go, go, while your hands are still empty enough to leave. Because the patient ones always check the line, and whatever they've marked, sooner or later, in the quiet and the cold, they come and collect. Leave a light on tonight. Tell me down in the comments where you kept it burning, and whether you'd have left at the thaw or stayed for the fur. Be honest. I'll be down there reading, same as always. Keep to your own line, and I'll see you next time by the next fire.